All right, welcome back. Once again, I got to point to our students in the room. They're the ones that actually sit down when somebody says sit down. So they're just used to that. You adult learners are a little ADD these days. So welcome back. We're going to introduce our next presenter. Ellen Wohl is a professor at CSU, in Department of Geosciences, and she's going to talk to us about impact of sediment and large wood on river systems. So please join me in welcoming Ellen.
Okay, I was told this has to be a specific distance from my mouth, so hopefully this works for those of you in the back. When Julie Kellenberger originally contacted me about this, she asked me about speaking about sediment, and I said, can I broaden it a little bit? So what I want to talk to you about are what I view as the three legs of the tripod of physical inputs that really support rivers. So I had a little problem with the animation of this slide, but if you focus on the upper left box first, when I think about what drives rivers as ecosystems, not just as conveyance mechanisms for water going downstream, I think about three primary fluxes. The first one, the Q, is water. The second one is sediment, that Q sub S, and then large wood. And large wood is the one that we're the least used to thinking about, partly because we, and I mean all we humans, have a long history of wood removal, so we don't see it anymore and we don't think about the effects of large wood. But historically, any riparian corridor that had forest, large wood played an important part. That includes perennial desert rivers in Arizona, for example, that had riparian forest. And those are just hypothetical fluctuating lines there for each of those inputs because I wanted to emphasize that they all fluctuate through time and space. And they interact with each other. I don't know if I'll try the pointer. Ooh, I managed it. In the context of a reach scale. So a reach scale, depending on the size of the river, it's tens to hundreds or hundreds of meters or maybe a few kilometers in length. But a portion of the river with a consistent valley geometry and morphology. And I refer to that as context. There's two components. The first is valley geometry. The contrasting photos there, you could have a very deep, narrow valley that has a minimal floodplain or no floodplain, or the opposite scenario in the photo on the upper right where you have a very wide, low gradient environment. So for the Poudre, think of the mountains versus going beyond the mountain front for those two end members. And the details of where the river reach is in the network, if you're in the headwaters versus a lowland area, there are differences in water, sediment, and large wood inputs. The spatial limits is just how wide is the valley? Will you never have a meandering channel, for example, because there's no floodplain and the channel can't move very much laterally? The boundary erosional resistance, as the river, as it moves back and forth across whatever valley bottom there is it being limited by bedrock or by something like a very loose sand and gravel? That makes a difference in how the river adjusts. And then base level stability. Base level is just the downstream-most point for the Poudre. It would be where it joins the South Platte. So is that point dropping or rising, which would trigger a wave of response going upstream? And the valley geometry and all the things I've just mentioned are part of a natural context, but I put human influence on here because we don't typically change valley geometry, but we change how the river interacts with that valley. Through flow regulation, through artificial levees, through bank stabilization, we limit the ability of water to go over the banks and onto the floodplain, or the ability of the channel to move back and forth. But in general, you have these fluxes that are interacting with this context, and that, if I look this way, I can't see much. Try this way so I can see the lower half of the slide. That results in a series of characteristics. So spatial heterogeneity here just refers to how much spatial variation is there in the river? How much does it differ from what I always refer to as an irrigation canal, which is designed to be very uniform, very simple, very homogeneous? Natural rivers have a lot more heterogeneity in their cross-sectional form, the way they move back and forth laterally. Second characteristic would be three-dimensional connectivity. The way the fluxes coming into the reach interact with the valley context determines the degree to which you have longitudinal connectivity going downstream, lateral between the channel and the floodplain, or vertical between the channel and the underlying hyporheic zone. Resilience, of course, would be how much the river corridor, so the channel and floodplain, change in response to human or natural disturbances, and how quickly they recover to pre-disturbance conditions. And then finally, integrity, and I think most of you are probably familiar with definitions of ecological integrity. My very simple version is just the ability to support a natural biotic community. Physical or geomorphic integrity has been defined as the ability of the river to adjust to changing inputs. So if you go back to those, what almost look like heartbeats or seismographs or something up here, if we have a big flood like 2013, does the river have the ability to widen through bank erosion or to avulse and move back and forth across the floodplain? To the degree that it does, then it has physical integrity. And the lower level here is just a series of specific examples of characteristics that you could look at to assess those terms that I've just been going through. And I want to emphasize that I think it's most important to think about all of these occurring in a river corridor. And again, that's the channel and the floodplain and the underlying hypereik zone. I'm very aware that all of our regulation and management in the US and in most countries separates the channel and the floodplain. And that's, as I think everybody in this room knows, that's a very artificial and unfortunate separation because the two are intimately connected. And the interactions between them really govern river condition and functionality. And before I go on, I just want to say that I have some photos in here that are all very wild looking because I tend to work in Rocky Mountain National Park. I look for the least human impacted systems I can find. But everything I'm going to say in this talk applies to any river, including the most stabilized and channelized portion of the South Platte in Denver. So what I'm talking about is not an either or, it's a continuum. And you can have different points along that continuum that govern what kind of ecosystem services you get from a river. So in going back to those three fluxes, I like to think of them as regimes. And the first one is a natural flow regime. I'm guessing most people in this audience are familiar with this paper that Leroy Poff and others did back in '97. It was published in the journal Bioscience. And it's been an enormously influential paper, very, very highly cited. And they started by saying the degree to which you have fluctuations in time and space of discharge entering a river corridor, flowing from either adjacent uplands as runoff or coming downstream, really governs how naturally dynamic that river is and how, what its ability is to continue to provide ecosystem services like fish or clean water or whatever it is that you want to choose as an example of an ecosystem service. So they said, well, stream flow, both the amount and how it's distributed in time, is this master variable. And it really, along with other non-physical characteristics like competition, predation, disease, it really governs the abundance and distribution of plants and animals in the river corridor. And they designated these series of 5 characteristics of stream flow. So how much, how frequently does it occur, either high or low flows? How long do those particular magnitudes last? What time of the year do they come? Because many plants and animals have their life cycles timed around the seasonal occurrence of high or low flows. And then how quickly do they change? And the rate of change is important. Hydroelectric dams in particular are infamous for having a hydrograph that looks like this. It's vertical, so you have an extremely fast rate of change that can cause damage or death to aquatic organisms in particular. Now, the nice thing about the natural flow regime is that you can quantify how much a particular reach of a river or river catchment deviates from a natural regime because the USGS primarily, but other agencies also maintain gauge records. We have systematic records of stream flow. In the Poudre, of course, they go back more than a century. And there are multiple ways to look at the difference between a natural flow regime and an altered one. One of the most common is this indicators of hydrologic alteration. There are these 32 flow parameters that they divided into 5 groups, and I'm not going to read them, you can read through them. But again, it's looking at changes in things like magnitude, frequency, duration, timing, all the other list of 5 that I went through a moment ago. And an example of this from the Roanoke River, this is from a paper by Brian Richter with the Nature Conservancy, who's done a lot of work with Leroy in developing some of these indices. 1942 on the left, 1975 on the right, so pre and post dam. And what you see is that pre-dam, you had a very high rate of fluctuation in the hydrograph, a rainfall-dominated river. After a dam was built on the river, you see that the tops of those flood peaks are reduced. And that's a pretty common scenario with the change in flow regime downstream from a dam or a diversion depends on the details of the site, but it's very common that you lose the really high magnitude flood peaks. And there's a very large body of literature that shows how important those are for maintaining the template of the river, the physical characteristics that create and maintain habitat. Okay, so a few years ago, a group of us, including Leroy, said, well, we also need to think about sediment and how important that is. And just think about some of the Great Plains rivers where if you want to do restoration, you have to pay attention to both the water and the sediment because they're so closely coupled that channel morphology is responding to both. So we just started with this point that the water and sediment are fundamental drivers, and if you really want to effectively manage rivers, you do have to consider both and their interactions. And we, instead of the 5 factors that Poff and others had for the natural flow regime, we had these 3 aspects of sediment dynamics. Inputs is sediment coming into the river corridor, again, from uplands or upstream. How much? What's the grain size distribution? How frequently is it coming in at a low amount all the time? Or if you're in the mountains, maybe it's dominated by debris flows and landslides after a wildfire. The second one, transport. Is there some minimum flow energy that needs to be exceeded before the sediment is redistributed within the river corridor or carried downstream? And then how frequently does that occur, over what duration, and how far does the sediment move? And then the last one, storage, of course, creates the physical characteristics, the skeleton, if you like, of a river corridor. So where the sediment is stored and how long it's stored there becomes critical. And all of those aspects of the sediment regime influence things like channel geometry, the stability, the basic habitat available for organisms, nutrients in the sense that fine sediment in particular can have nutrients adsorbed to silt and clay, and the disturbance regime associated with sediment mobility. Now, the tricky part of all this is that rivers do respond to both water and sediment discharge, but the two are not necessarily directly coupled. In many cases, they're not. So a photo here is from Google Earth. It's the Colorado River at Lee's Ferry, which is right at the upstream end of Grand Canyon. So it's coming out of Glen Canyon Dam. The big plume of suspended sediment that you see is coming out of the Paria, a tributary that is not regulated and has very erodible sedimentary rocks. So there had been a rainstorm and a moderate flood before this particular image was taken. And the amount of sediment coming into the Colorado there is not entirely coupled with discharge. You do need the flood flows to move it, but you can't just assume a linear relation or strict correlation. And the tricky part about sediment is we don't have the analogous long record of stream gauge information on that we do on discharge. So it's really hard to assess a sediment regime the way you can a natural flow regime, or to assess reference conditions. And to make this very blunt, more than 23,000 gauge stations with stream flow that goes back more than a decade, just over 1,600 for suspended load, and none for bed load. So in that scenario, you can't develop something like the indicators of, it would be ISA, indicators of sediment alteration. You also these are 3-dimensional plots of suspended sediment through time at 3 different rivers in the continental US, and it just makes the point that there's a tremendous amount of temporal variability at these particular stations that are representative of other rivers. So what we did in that paper was say, well, if you don't know what the natural sediment regime is like and it's hard to quantify, maybe what is most important is to focus on a balanced sediment regime. And this essentially occurs when you have the available sediment being supplied, transported through the reach without net change over whatever you define as your time scale. So there's no net aggradation or erosion and incision. The transport capacity is in balance with the sediment supply, and hence the river is dynamically stable. And if you are trying to manage to create habitat, for example, or a particular flow depth, and you basically have to consider sediment dynamics to manage the channel geometry, then understanding that balance between sediment supply and the amount of energy available to transport it as flow becomes critical. And then a couple years ago, when I was doing that second slide that I started with of the 3 inputs interacting with the context, I looked at it and I said, oh, we need a natural wood regime too. So that paper came out in the same journal. All 3 of these have been in Bioscience last year. And it's a harder sell in many respects to get people to think about large wood, even in a place like the Poudre, where if you look at Fremont's descriptions, there were cottonwood gallery forests out. Well, obviously, there were conifer forests in the headwaters, and there were cottonwood gallery forests out beyond Fort Collins. So historically, there would have been a lot of wood in that river. But we started with the natural flow regime categories of magnitude, frequency, duration, timing, and rate, and we added mode, which is just how is the wood coming in? Is it individual tree fall, or is it something like avalanches and up in the mountains here that bring in a lot of wood? How is it transported? Again, individual logs or rafts of logs that you have in larger rivers, and then is it stored in dispersed or in jams? And the key point that we wanted to make in this paper is that the interaction between water, sediment, and wood has a very strong influence on all of the parameters that I talked about in that second slide. So just quickly, if you only work below the mountain front and you're not used to seeing large wood, a nice channel-spanning log jam with a big backwater, and that's what the backwater looks like under the water level. In that lower photo, the log jam is at the left, and I stuck the camera in the water without seeing what I was photographing. I was very pleased to see a salmonid enjoying the nice habitat. So wood is the trickiest of all of these to try and think about and manage, because we have, I said we have 0 records for bedload on the USGS gauging network. We have no records of wood transport either. There are a few research studies that have been published that use things like video imagery or time-lapse photos, and we can infer changes in wood based on the amount of wood stored, particularly with imagery like NAPE, the National Agriculture Imagery Program. But I think one way to think about how wood might come into and move through a river network and the effect it might have is to think about wood process domains. So this is just a hypothetical illustration from the headwaters down. And what we're doing with these individual circles is just pointing out differences in that recruitment, transport, and storage mechanisms as you move through a drainage network. So I would expect to see, I do see differences in how wood comes into, is retained or transported, and interacts with the river corridor up in Rocky Mountain National Park than I would see, say, in the transition zone going through the hogbacks in Fort Collins. And understanding the context in which you're looking at the potential for either managing wood or reintroducing it can provide a very useful set of insights. So I would say globally, the Pacific Northwest region of the US is ahead of everybody else in terms of reintroducing wood as part of river restoration. I started to see it here after the 2013 flood, which is very encouraging. And I got an awful lot of calls right after that flood from consultants, from federal people, from state, county people saying, how much wood should we put in? Where should we put it? Because so little is known. But we are starting to develop enough empirical data to at least put things in the context of looking at where you are in the network and what the process domains might be. So I'll just end by saying that, again, right now we're mostly set up to manage water flows when we think about trying to restore or mitigate. And I think that's very important, but it really has to be, at the minimum, a two-stage approach. We've got to think about water and sediment together. And in many areas, if we can add wood into that mix, I didn't, because this is a short talk, I didn't go into the extensive body of evidence for the physical and ecological benefits of having large wood in channels that are naturally forested. But it's there. It affects everything from water quality to biomass and biodiversity and attenuation of pretty much every type of material moving downstream. So I would really like to see us expand our management paradigm to think about all 3 of these. Again, what I think of as legs of the tripod of physical processes in rivers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Questions for Ellen? We've got microphones running around. Where? Raise your hand again.
Thank you, Ellen. The question I have is regarding flood flows and the cleansing effect of flood flows. So after the High Park fire, there was a lot of sediment, ash, like deposited near Watson Lake. It was just filled in. Then the 2013 floods came and cleaned it out. And that was very important because it cleaned out the channel. My question has to do with the Northern Integrated Supply Project and they're going to be skimming off those flood flows, and they're going to be substituting some pulse flows instead. Can you speak to how effective those are, what studies show how effective pulse flows are versus the natural flood flows of the river?
Pulse flows, the largest body of literature, I'd say, comes from the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon ecosystem. They're not as effective because you don't typically, depends on the details, as always, of the pulses, but they're not as high magnitude and they're not as long duration. And for a pulse to be effective in, for example, flushing out fine sediment and organic matter, two things have to happen. In the Poudre, you have a very coarse-grained bed. It's not easily mobilized. It doesn't mobilize even during most snowmelt flows. I've been here since 1989, and one of the first things I did was, I'm going to look at sediment transport. So I painted a non-toxic line across a gravel bar in the Poudre at low flow and then waited for snowmelt. And I went out there on 14 to look at it. This is up in Poudre Canyon during the snowmelt peak, and the water was waist deep over that surface. And when I came back, the line was intact. It subsequently decayed. But the point is, there's a big threshold to mobilize the coarse material. And you have to mobilize the coarse material before all the fines that have infilled and all the organic matter, and by fines I mean sand, silt, clay, gets flushed. Otherwise, it's nestled down in a nice sheltered spot, and it's very hard to get rid of it. So you need to, first of all, have the magnitude to mobilize that coarse material, and then you need the duration to keep that fine material moving downstream. If you have a really short pulse, it may be mobilized, but it's going to end up not that far downstream, potentially, depending on the length of the pulse.
We have a question over here, and we have 1 minute for the question and 1 minute for the answer, so choose wisely.
Okay. I was wondering, sometimes we have people wanting to clean up the stream. We did that in the Vail Valley a lot. And from the picture that you showed of the log jam and the fish having a home there, it seems like if well-meaning people came along and cleaned that up after the flood put it there, we're wrecking people's, fish's homes and habitat homes and stuff like that. What's your thought about the best way to respond to river cleanups and stuff like that?
Absolutely. If you're cleaning up a river from wood and sediment, it's not dirty. To me, cleanup means getting rid of old car body parts or tires. Wood and sediment are fundamental. If you have wood in there, it doesn't just provide habitat for fish, it creates hypereic exchange, and the hypereic zone under the channel is sometimes called the river's liver. Very important for denitrification, for modifying fluctuations in water temperature, because if you're not familiar with the hypereic zone, it's water that originates in the channel, flows a short distance in the substream, returns to the channel. So it mitigates cold, but particularly warm water temperatures. Taking wood out is a very, very bad idea. Sometimes it has to be done for hazards to infrastructure, but taking it out to make the river look nice, you're doing a great disservice.
Thank you, Ellen. So while our next presenter comes up on the stage, show of hands, how many have learned something new already this morning? Wow, awesome. So you either came in stupid or, sorry. Show of hands, how many liked the beach ball exercise to wake up in the morning? Only half the room. And a whistle. Thank you. I know the back of the room learned a lesson. Don't sit in the back of the room because they're gone. There's like 3 people left there, so they either went home or they're sitting amongst you. So we got Chuck Rhoades next. Chuck is a research biogeochemist with Rocky Mountain Research Station at U.S. Forest Service. He's going to talk to us about wildfire impacts on river water quality. So please welcome Chuck. That's your slide. You can watch him there. He's your timer guy.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Yep. Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm between you and lunch, so hopefully I'll speed this right along and get you out to eat. So thank you very much for the invitation. This is a great meeting. I've learned a lot. I have, and I enjoyed playing the beach volleyball as well. So I think I'm on the right side. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the direct impairments or things that influence water quality. And one of the areas that I'm most interested in is wildfire. So we'll start with that. So let me see, do I know how to do this? No, no, that's it, okay. There we go. Aha, perfect. Okay, so as most people in Colorado know, wildfires are a natural part of our forest ecosystems. They rely on them both to regenerate. They live with them for a variety of reasons. And there's sort of a couple different sort of endpoints that we're probably familiar with in Colorado. We have our lodgepole forests that require wildfires to regenerate. So without a fire, the stands kind of decay, become very old, and it actually is the catastrophe of a wildfire that creates the new forest. That's the Yellowstone fire story that we're all familiar with from our ecology classes. The other side of that coin is the ponderosa pine or lower montane system, where lower severity fires burn fairly frequently. They come through areas, and you can see in the picture on the lower right-hand side, where repeated fires have come through and scarred that tree, but have not killed it. And so we have to think a little bit about sort of the natural regimes as we're talking about wildfire effects. But most of us have embraced the idea that there's a lot of change going on in our ecosystems, and this is a slide that combines some of the observed record of climate change, showing the changes in snowpack across the western U.S., also looking at the changes in peak runoff. So we now have runoff happening several weeks earlier, and that translates into a longer fire season. So globally, we have a 19% increase in the length of the fire season. Some states like California, you never really get out of the fire season anymore. It's something that's sort of on continuous alert. And so that's a really big deal when we're thinking about when fires happen and what they're doing. So we have more fires, and we also are having much larger fires. So we're seeing 2 times more of these especially large fires since the 1980s, and that relates to some of these climate drivers I mentioned. So we have earlier springs, and that dries fuels out, and we have earlier snowmelt, so things are drier longer. The other side to that, though, is kind of interesting, and we can thank or blame Smokey Bear for this. A lot of the increase in fires has to do with our history of fire suppression. So this is something that we've done on the landscape. The Forest Service and other agencies have become very effective, and over 98% of the fires that get started are put out before they get large. And that's a great thing. We've all gotten used to that. But what that means is that we have a lot more accumulation of fuels or vegetation in the forest. And so when fires burn, there's more continuous fuels, and they tend to be larger. Not only larger, they tend to be more difficult to put out. And not only that, they become more damaging. And that's kind of where we're talking today. So most everybody here is familiar with sort of our history of wildfires along the Front Range, and the Front Range is kind of bracketed by 2 very famous fires. I suspect everybody here was here during the High Park. Can I get some hands? So yeah, most of you, and many of you may be here because of the High Park fire. That may have been some of your introduction. How many of you were here for the Hayman fire? And so there's fewer, but still a lot. The Hayman fire kind of kicked things off and made a big awakening of folks along the Front Range that the condition of our forests, forest health, the role of fire suppression, climate change, that's all sort of related to wildfires and, more importantly, the people in this room, the water that we rely on. So the millions of people along the Front Range who have seen a number of these little red spots get started are very aware of that connection. So water quality is one of these topics. We've heard it from a regulatory perspective. We heard about it from a sediment perspective, and various other ways to think about it. I'm a biogeochemist, and I mostly look at nutrients, carbon, and sediment to an extent as it moves through ecosystems. We are reliant on on our forest ecosystems to provide clean water. 2/3 of the water that the public in the US gets arrives from forest land. So the headwaters are clearly very important for drinking water, for water supply. We're also rely on it for aquatic life. So reduction in water quality influences, fish habitat influences, water treatment, and it also has a big effect on our recreation industry in Colorado. As a forester, I think about it from another side as well. The nutrients and the sediment and the carbon that are washing down the stream, that's bad for business if you're trying to grow forests. Those are nutrients the forests rely on, and so the loss of those are an indication of it's the disturbance as it's happening, and maintaining those in the watershed is kind of a good thing for forests. And if you think about this kind of simple diagram, in an undisturbed system, we have kind of a good balance between the supply of nutrients up in the watershed, the things that the plants rely on to grow, and the release of those nutrients. So plants pretty much scour the soils and the subsurface flow to release, to retain as much of the nutrients as possible. So we end up with very clean water because the trees are retaining it all on the landscape, whether that's in the uplands or in the riparian area. Ellen mentioned the hyporheic zone, and there are processes within the stream channel as well, periphyton and so on, that are sucking nutrients out of that stream channel. If you take the top off, you kill the vegetation, you remove the organic layer, the hill slopes and the watersheds are much more exposed to erosion losses, and there's also a huge change in demand. So there's no vegetation, nutrients are just washing down either subsurface or in some cases as runoff. And so we see these large differences. The picture in the upper right-hand corner was pre and post Hayman in some of those landscapes, so you can get a really good picture of how that change looks. So the effects that I'm talking about are all sort of scaled with the level of disturbance. Wildfires vary a lot, so some have huge effects on water quality, some have much smaller effects. And that really has to do with the amount of the organic layer and the vegetation that's consumed. And foresters talk about fire severity. So if you have a severe wildfire, you've consumed almost all the organic layer, the needles and so on, and you've left mineral soil exposed. Almost all the vegetation has been charred and killed. Moderate is somewhere in between, and a low severity fire, it may have burned some of the O-horizon, but you still have protection from that litter layer. And the map in the middle shows a number of tributaries of the Hayman fire, and the colors kind of correspond to the different classes I mentioned. So the orange is high severity. And the thing to note is that all wildfires influence tributaries differently. So you have tributaries that 100% of them that were burned at high severity. That was a pretty big effect. You have other ones that had a large amount of the catchment that didn't even fall within the burn perimeter. So that would have a different sort of effect. Hayman is kind of a unique fire in that a very large percentage of it was burned at high severity, and the photo of that, or the picture of that, shows that large area of high severity on the left-hand side. And interestingly, a big part of that burned within one day, burned about 27 miles, driven by winds. So a very, very severe situation. Okay, so wildfire has effects on water quality that scale with burn severity. So we've been studying the Hayman fire since, in fact, before the fire, but the diagrams I'm showing you are the first 5 years after the fire, and you can see for both nitrate, which is the mobile biologically reactive form of nitrogen that we study a lot because it's something that really responds following fires, you can see a 2 order of magnitude increase scaling with the amount of catchments that were burned. And there's a threshold, 50–60%, where things are double what they were in low and moderate fires. Total dissolved nitrogen shows the same pattern. It's not quite as severe. If you kind of bin up those streams and look at instantaneous values on the other graphs, you can see there's a seasonal pattern in stream nitrogen, but you can see in those burn streams that's staying elevated for much longer. In some years where it was peaking 2 to 3 years after the fire, it sort of never dropped back down to pre-summer baseline. So we had this change in behavior as well as changes in peaks. So that was not terribly surprising. Often there are many fires that have shown effects the first few years after. We went back to the Hayman fire with some additional funding 14 and 15 years after the fire and expected to kind of put a dot at the end of this Hayman story and be done with it. And we were surprised to see that a lot of the wildfire effects on stream nitrogen remained active. And so the different panels I'm showing are across flow seasons, so rising limb, falling limb, and base flow. And you can see that our extensively burned areas still have higher nitrate and total dissolved nitrogen relative to areas that burned to a lower degree. So the moderate in this case had burned 30 to 60%. It's notable that those were still somewhat elevated relative to the unburned areas. A couple other points to make. One is that the dissolved organic carbon numbers are kind of off kilter with the nitrogen. So in this case, carbon is highest in our moderate burn areas, which is noteworthy, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And something I'm not showing here, but that is noteworthy, is that the sediment pulse, it is at the bottom, I'm sorry, the sediment pulse was mostly over by this 10-year or 15-year period. There were some increases, but it was no longer significant. That recovered much faster than the nutrients. So the work that we've seen at Hayman, a lot of folks realize, boy, that was a really unique, extreme fire. Well, looking more broadly across the U.S., people at mines and folks I've collaborated with in Canada are starting to see these patterns as there's more data available and people are looking kind of with a different eye to things. So looking at USGS data on bigger streams across 159 fires in the western U.S., Ashley Rust and colleagues at Mines found that the increases in nitrogen and phosphorus are fairly common, and that again they scale with the extent. So the bars on the right were burned 25 to 100% of the catchment, and moving from left to right, they're 1 to 10 years following the fire. So it's a common event to see long-term water quality effects. Same in Canada. Okay, so. Not all fires, right? So we're talking about a common events, but this is from the Poudre River report. Jared Heath gave me a copy of this a few months ago, and the Cache-la Poudre River seems to be recovering fine. So of course we're talking about some extreme conditions, but not all conditions. So the Little South Fork, it burned about 17% of that catchment, and about half of that was burned at high severity. So it would fall into a condition that maybe was on the mid to lower end. There was an increase in nitrogen at the beginning, big increases in concentrations, but there's been a dramatic decline in the loads of nitrogen since that sort of initial pulse. So it's dropped down to about 50% of what it was in those first years after the fire. There's still about a 25% increase over the baseline, but it seems to be heading in the right direction. So we'll keep our fingers crossed with the Poudre. And it seems, in terms of the revegetation, it looks nothing like the Hayman fire, so it seems like that's coming back much better. Carbon I mentioned a minute ago, and this is something I wanted to get back to because there's so many people here that are interested in water treatment and some of the other ecosystem services coming out of watersheds. Carbon has a big effect on the formation of disinfection byproducts, which are potentially carcinogenic compounds that are created during chlorination in the treatment effect. And those compounds scale with the amount of DOC, or the amount of carbon coming out. So in the case that I showed, where we see an increase in carbon in moderate fires, we're actually seeing an increase in this formation potential of disinfection byproducts, which is interesting and something that's kind of novel. Now, we also know from work done by Fernando Rosario Ortiz and other people around the US that when you heat soils or you heat vegetation, it's sort of the moderate temperatures that release the most carbon. So there's kind of a double whammy going on. There are these disinfection byproduct compounds, and there's sort of an increase in carbon in some of these moderate burns. That's relevant to the kinds of fires that are going on. Thank you. So why are we having these effects? And I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the studies that we've been doing. This is work done by Allison Ray at Colorado State and Tim Covino. One option would be that the streams are dead, that they're not taking up nutrients in the stream channel, and that they're just a pipe or a conduit, as Ellen mentioned. So we look at chlorophyll A as a surrogate for algal uptake, and the graph I'm showing you on the left-hand side shows algal production in burned areas and unburned areas. And what you can see is there's actually higher algae. If you look at the far left bar, that's an uncontrolled, unamended stream, and those numbers in the burned watershed are higher. So there's more algal production in burned channels. They're alive, they're taking up nutrients. The panels on the right show what happens when you fertilize streams, which is a way that we look at nutrient limitations. And the upper graph in the unburned area shows that they're highly nutrient limited. As I mentioned, forests don't let much nitrogen into the stream, and the stream biota require more. And so if you fertilize them, they grow more. The forests that have been burned have high nitrogen in them, and they're less likely to respond. So we actually have a shift in nutrient limitations in burned watersheds. But no, they're not the problem. The streams are taking up nutrients. Maybe it's the soils. So if we look across ecotones going from burned into unburned watersheds, we see actually a decline in soil nitrogen. We don't see an increase. And if we look at some of the biologically active compounds, they're lower in the along burned hillsides. We do see an increase in the amount of nitrogen that's leaching out the bottom, though. So supply doesn't seem to be the issue, but demand does. We have this release coming out of the bottom of them. So vegetation, that's kind of the thing that we have left, and the photo of Hayman kind of shows you starkly what the graph above it is showing. So the graph above is NDVI, which is a remote sensing technique that looks at the greenness of a landscape. And you can see the orange lines were right after the fire. You can see the dramatic drop, and then this slowed increase as these systems have grown back. Hayman, for those of you who have visited it, is kind of a shrubland now. There's a lot of yucca, there's some grasses, but it's not a ponderosa pine forest like it used to be. And so it's only about halfway back to that sort of greenness, biomass, and nutrient uptake that we would talk about. So some of the things that we're talking about is this drastic change in the retention of nutrients in these watersheds. So the riparian areas are much more exposed, and they're sort of linked with the amount of stream nitrogen. So if we look across our watersheds, the more riparian area, the lower our nitrogen release. So we have a link between the amount of nutrient release and the vegetation. Okay, I'm going to kind of skip through some of these real quickly. Two kind of important points to finish with here. So in Colorado, we're sort of experiencing some new conditions, and I think that sort of provides some opportunities and some challenges as we think about fire moving forward. Many of us have lived through the bark beetle outbreak, so in the 2000s we saw forests lose 70% or more of their overstory, and at the time people were very concerned about wildfires, and we really didn't see many fires during that sort of red needle phase when everybody was freaking out. But now we're starting to see them. So the diagram on the left are the fires around North Park that have happened in the last few years. We've now burned over 130,000 acres of this gray phase lodgepole pine. The thing that's interesting about that is it's hardly been studied. It's very rarely been seen, and we really don't know what tree regeneration is going to be like. We know from some of the initial studies that we've done that because the trees have been dead for a decade, they're not regenerating very well. So the figure on the right shows what it should show is a big pulse of tree growth in those lodgepole pines after they're burned. That's what you expect. We're seeing that that's not really happening, which is cause for concern. And to end on sort of a positive note, or on a positive note, so one of the things that's really exciting about water quality in this particular area and in the Cache la Poudre is the huge effort that's been going in to try to get more fuels management and prescribed fire on the landscape. And this was required efforts of many people in this room, the folks on national forests, state forest lands, private landowners, and the idea that we're trying to protect watersheds by preventing catastrophic wildfires. The take-home point, though, as a researcher that I would like to mention is that we actually know very little about how prescribed fires influence water quality. We know something about what wildfires do, but we know very little. We've started some work with citizen scientists to actually start sampling some of these areas, but this is some of the only work that's been done to date, and so we're really excited about following this work up. And with that, I will thank you and apologize for going a little bit over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chuck. We have time for a question or two. Yeah, you got time. Nope. We would have kicked you off earlier. Anyone? I see one back there. Oh, go there first.
I was wondering if you've looked at fate and transport of the firefighting chemicals that the planes are using to suppress fires.
I have not. That's a great question, very timely, and there are people that are very interested in that, both from a contaminant perspective and also from a nutrient perspective, because a lot of the firefighting chemicals some of them contain fertilizer because they're trying to get things growing afterwards. So, and they are often put down right over stream. So it's something that is a concern for sure. I'd love to work on it, but I'm not.
Got another one back there.
Hi, are you seeing any trends in lower elevation ponderosa pine forest fires and conversion to grassland shrublands throughout the western United States?
Yes, definitely. I think the Hayman is one good example. That forest is not slated to return to a ponderosa pine closed canopy forest for decades to 100 years still, based on work that's been done through CFRI at Colorado State, looking at cones moving in and trees kind of marching into those landscapes. So that's one that's going to take quite a long time. There are a number of others. High Meadow, it's the same situation. So a number of our lower elevation forests are in potentially a new kind of condition. That's one of the slides I sort of jumped over. People in Yellowstone and people in various other places who have been looking at fires in recent years have looked at what additional stress from drying conditions after a fire, looking at what repeated fires, one after another, or in the case of these gray phase situations, one different disturbance after another. They're all kind of new conditions, and we have very little to go on, but there are a number of studies in different ecosystems that are saying this is something to watch out for. It seems like things are changing.
Could squeeze in one more if we got it right here.
Hi, this is very interesting. I'm down from southeastern Wyoming, and we're seeing a lot more cyanobacteria blooms. And these are systems I think of as being very poor in nutrients, right. And I wondered if there's any study on the connection between forest fires and algal blooms.
Yeah, there are, and one of my colleagues that I listed, Alex Chow, has done a number of studies looking at that, and sort of the flip side of the data that Ali Ray produced is looking at sort of algal production in streams. It's definitely something people have seen sort of just in terms of ecosystem function, but in terms of harmful algal blooms, people have seen that as well. You have so much more light, temperature, and nutrients in these systems, it's sort of inevitable that would be the response.
Excellent. Thank you, Chuck.